All Things Alice. This podcast will explore the cultural phenomenon of Alice in Wonderland as artistic landmark and global symbol of inspiration and imagination. I'm your host, Frank Beddor, the author of the Looking Glass Wars trilogy. Let's explore, what is it about Alice? Welcome to the show, everyone. This week, I'm lucky to be joined by Arnold Hirshon, who happens to be the president of the North American Lewis Carroll Society. I bet you didn't know that there was a Lewis Carroll Society. Matter of fact, there's many of them, which we're going to talk about. He's the perfect guest. He's an Alice academic and an expert in the world of Wonderland illustrations. And I can't wait to talk to him about some of my favorite Alice-inspired artists. So let's tumble down the rabbit hole with Arnold. Hey, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining. I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts. You're currently the president of the Lewis Carroll Society in North America?
That's correct.
Okay, great, because I'm really interested in the Lewis Carroll Society. I, as you know, have written these Looking Glass Wars books, and part of my metafiction was some confrontations with Lewis Carroll Society members when I was first publishing my book in the UK. I created a story. I was invited onto the BBC to talk about Alice and why I decided to write it, and there was a little controversy because I'm an American rewriting it, and it was even worse that I was a movie producer. So when I got on the show, just seat of my pants, said, oh yeah, there was all these Lewis Carroll Society members at the airport protesting, and they had placards with "Off with Frank Beddor's head." And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be interviewing the president of the Lewis Carroll Society. I got to give that story up to start this.
Yeah. But that was the UK Society, or was that the North American Society?
I didn't know that there were multiple societies, so maybe you could start by filling our listeners in on that there are various societies and how it was formed and your involvement and what the mandate is.
So the Lewis Carroll Society in North America, that's the one that I'm president of, started 50 years ago. This is our 50th anniversary year.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, it's great. The basic purpose is to advance the study and interest in any of the works by Lewis Carroll, whether they are mathematical works, logical works, whether it's games, puzzles, of course, the Alice books, Hunting of the Snark, Phantasmagoria, anything. And it could be any aspect. It can be the literature itself. It can be illustration, music, movies, plays, the whole gamut. It's in any form that, and of course, Lewis Carroll was so dominant in some, even within his lifetime, he was having theatrical productions being made. So all of that is really part of our remit as we think of it. The Lewis Carroll Society in the UK, which is known as the Lewis Carroll Society, they continue to do their work. There are also societies. There's one now in Brazil. There's one in the Netherlands. There's one in Japan. So we're all loosely affiliated in our interest. But the Lewis Carroll Society in North America is probably the one with the greatest reach and the most international membership. It really extends beyond North America. We have about 10 to 15, 20% of our members are actually outside of North America.
And how many members do you have? And then what do the members do in terms of interacting with all of this work? Because it's in pop culture across, so many mediums. It's so deeply seated. You could spend your life studying and trying to keep up with it and not even scratch the surface, I imagine. So what are the members mostly interested in?
So a combination of things. One, we have a journal that comes out 2 times a year. It's the Night Letter is the name of it. And that is pretty extensive. It is everything from scholarly articles to just fun facts and latest occurrences found in popular culture, whether it's a political cartoon or whether it's a quote. It includes information about newly published editions, illustrated editions, typically, where regardless of where they were published anywhere in the world. So that's one element of our educational programming. The other is we run two conferences per year, one virtual, one in person. The last one was in Cleveland in this past September. We're looking to hold another one in the fall of 2024 as a celebration of our anniversary. And those topics can be a very wide range. Again, they run from you don't have to be a scholar at all and just have a general interest in Alice. So this last time, there were people discussing Alice in popular music and rock music. We had people discussing Alice in dance, Alice in literature, Alice in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So translated editions. So those tend to be a fairly wide gamut. And then we run typically about 8 to 10 virtual programs throughout the year. And those are, it can be an illustrator discussing a work in progress or a recently illustrated book. It can be Alice in the movies. Those, again, run that whole range, and it is not just Alice related. And then we also have collectors talking about their collections and latest acquisitions and latest things that they found for the first time.
That seems like would be a big section of the membership because there is so much to collect. There's so many interesting books. I have a book that I collected, and I'm not a collector, but I'm going to put it up and see if you've ever seen this book.
Yes, absolutely. I know it well.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
I was fascinated with the lyrics, and I mean, I think it was 1921. The art is amazing.
Yes.
But yeah, I picked that up at some. I think there was an auction somewhere. I think it was the first and only time I've competed for a piece of Lewis Carroll's, life. So
Yeah,
you know that well because you've collected that book?
well, both I have a copy of it sitting over there on my shelves. I actually have both that version, which is the original, as well as a couple of reprinted versions. There's a delightful illustration of beautiful soup in that.
Mm,
Um, Soup
hmm.
bowl has
Yes.
long pair of legs.
Yes, I
Uh,
love that image. Love it.
yeah, and he's really a full card, brilliant illustrator. But I also have original sheet music from the early 20th century. Irving Berlin composed three different Alice in Wonderland songs. I have two out of the three, and so there's that whole wide range of things. My interest evolved. It started. I was an English major in college, so my interest started from the literature side and from the text, but more and more it gravitated towards the illustration.
Mm.
It's by far the most illustrated, the Alice books in particular are the most illustrated books of fiction in the world.
Yeah, there's so many remarkable facts. I mean, that it's the second most quoted literary works in the world behind the Bible. I think there's more foreign language books than Harry
Yeah,
Potter, like twice Harry Potter. I didn't even know. I think it's 175 or 190 countries. I didn't know there
right.
was that many countries. That's
Well,
remarkable.
it's languages and dialects as well,
Okay,
because
dialects. Okay.
sometimes it can be two or three dialects from the same country. It could be like Catalan in Spain as well as in Spanish. And that's or multiple dialects in Chinese.
Now, is there somebody that collects everything that's coming out so that you have an archive? So you brought up political cartoons, and during the Trump administration, there was a massive use of Alice in Wonderland to describe the functionality of the government and
Yeah.
down the rabbit hole and off with your head and through the looking glass and was used, I mean, often and to great
Tweedledum,
comic.
Tweedledee.
Yes, that was hilarious. To great comedic effect. So, does somebody collect those things, or are they just talked about in these conferences?
It's all individual collectors. There's no, there are some institutions certainly that collect, but I don't think that any institution by any means has comprehensive collections, meaning exhaustive, what we would call completist collection.
Okay.
And so there are certainly, I won't name names on this because they may or may not want their names named, but I am not a completist collector. A completist, there were, hundreds published by the original publisher, Macmillan.
Hmm.
And so you have the first thousand, the first 2,000, then you have the 10,000, the
Hmm.
50,000. There are people who collect all of those,
Wow.
every single one of them. I do not.
Wow.
To me, if I have one good copy of Tenniel, it's enough.
Right.
Because I use my collection for research
Hmm.
and for personal interest.
Right.
So I'm not necessarily trying to collect a perfect copy of a first edition of something. I want representative illustrations from that illustrator, and I want something that I can also afford. Because some of these things can go literally into the millions of dollars. Many of them will go into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that is not the sort of collection I personally kind of try to build. And then the institutional collections, there are certainly some very major collections in not just the British Library, but in North America, University of Texas, New York University, University of Toronto. Those are just two. There are probably about 20 I could rattle off that have significant collections. The Morgan Library in New York, Harvard. But very often they stopped collecting at a certain point. They're not necessarily collecting late 20th century, early 21st century. Because I'm interested in illustration, and so many of these illustrators have come out and continue to come out now, trying to keep up with all of the new ones that are coming out is just impossible.
Yeah, yeah, that must be very, very challenging. It would be amazing to have an institution that collects everything that they can find in pop culture. I recently wrote a blog because my daughter loves Taylor Swift, and I wrote a blog about her Wonderland song, which I did not realize there was such a thing. and suddenly I was a very cool dad for 24 hours. Um, but there's so much out there, and it's really interesting. And visually, it's really interesting, whether it's the albums or, as you said, the illustrations or photographs of gardens. I mean, there is just these cartoons I find terrific. It'd be great to have, the movie posters.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And not just movie posters, but there are also pop culture posters from theatrical productions, from concerts, from movies. So there are people who collect, yeah, and there a lot of people are like mine is more of a specialized collection. There are people who collect just the posters. There are people
Hmm.
who collect just sculptures,
Hmm.
who collect just figurines,
Hmm.
uh, just soft sculpture, not just sculpture, but soft sculpture. So you get this wide variety of people who have very varying interests, who are all joined together by sharing some element of interest in the works of Lewis Carroll.
I'm very interested in doing a documentary about Alice, why Alice is a muse for so many artists. And, like Taylor Swift and the Wachowski brothers who did Matrix and, some of the more pop culture aspects of Alice in Wonderland and use that to bring people into this deeper Lewis Carroll world and start to show them things like, look at Guinness beer used Alice for years and years and years. Why? Why is Alice, and this is part of the the podcast is, why does Alice last? What is it about Alice that we keep reinventing her to reflect our contemporary world?
Well, Alice herself, and just on the Guinness point, the interesting thing is Guinness adopted Alice because it was really being used for the health benefits of beer. They were these were they were sending
Yeah.
these things to doctors
Yeah.
as each year, and then it was just an amusing way of,
Yeah.
and obviously when it started in the 1930s and through the 1960s, when they were doing it in a way that everybody would know what the cultural reference was.
Right.
But it, but Alice herself is essentially a cipher.
Hmm.
You know, Alice is not the main character. All the other characters are the main. Now, all of these things are getting absorbed through Alice, and she's learning as she's going along. So she makes for the perfect foil for any number of characters who come into her life and then leave her life in the next episode, which is essentially usually the next chapter. But there are so many ways of interpreting so much of the text. There are so many ways of visually representing Alice.
Hmm.
For example, you know, the Disney character is to some people more common than the Tenniel
Mm.
version of it.
Oh,
And
100%. 100%.
and they have no idea that Disney's was not the first movie that was created.
Right.
That there had been, what, 50 years of Alice movie making before Disney showed up on the scene, and Disney
Yeah.
would have done it himself earlier, but he dropped the project
Hmm.
and picked it up later. So there are all of those threads that keep coming through, but there's so much ambiguity in the story. The scenes are not plotted out in any particular. You could move the chapters in a different order, not so much in Through the Looking Glass, but certainly in Wonderland. You could change the order if you were reading it to a child who never had read the books before. The child would have no idea what order you're reading them in
Right.
because she doesn't, except at the very beginning of the chapter, or and then Alice entered
Hmm.
or Alice left. The rest of it is, you know, there's no logical sequence to it. There's no description of the backgrounds. There's no description of any of the things. Most of the things on the table in the Mad Tea Party, they're not mentioned at all. So that gives, whether it's a filmmaker or whether it's an illustrator, it gives them license to make it up as they go along.
Well, to your point, until Tim Burton came along, the all the other adaptations have had the flaw of being episodic and trying to give agency to Alice. And one of the reasons I wrote my novels was to give her that agency so that she meets Lewis Carroll. He doesn't believe her story, but ultimately she is destined, and ultimately it's her agency. And then she moves through enough of a plot that it feels more contemporary. There was more agency in The Wizard of Oz for Dorothy than for Alice, because she had a very specific goal and you knew where she was trying to get, and there was obstacles along the way, and those obstacles became friends, and then they helped her in the end. So I do think that's really interesting. What you're saying is that as a siphon, she allows all the other characters, and you can imbue with those characters so many creative choices. And I think that's probably a really strong reason why she's such an amazing muse for so many creators.
Well, and I think that that's the difference also between Wonderland and Looking Glass. I've often described it as Wonderland is a vertical tale. Alice falls down a rabbit hole and then proceeds through things without any rhyme or reason. Her conversation with the Cheshire Cat,
Mm-hmm.
you know, where should I go? You
Mm-hmm.
know, go any way you want. If you don't know where you're going, any route will take you there. Whereas Looking Glass is a very horizontal tale. It is, Alice has an objective. She wants to get from one end of the chessboard to the other end of the chessboard, so that she can be crowned queen. And along the way, she's going to meet people who will, she hopes will help her along the way. And most of them in Looking Glass do help her,
Hmm.
whereas in Wonderland, they don't really, many of them don't care.
They
So the Hatter, the March Hare, they're living their own life there. They're really not going to do very much to help. And some of the Looking Glass ones don't either. Tweedledum and Tweedledee are not the most helpful characters in the world. Um,
Well, let me ask you something, because I think that is very helpful in terms of breaking down the two books. I didn't think of it that way. That's really interesting. But it seems like it's pretty common that there's two camps in interpretation. There's the whimsical fantasy dream aspect of the text that people take away, and then there is the surreal nightmare in the illogical and the kind of self-inflicted insanity that happens in the book. Do you fall into either of those camps, or is there another camp as a scholar that you look at the works from?
it's an interesting question. I think the difference that you're speaking to in part is this an adult book for adults, or is this a book for children? The first part of what you said to me is more the children's book, which can be appreciated by children at a certain level. But even in Victorian times, there were going to be any number of references in the text that no child was going to really pick up on. To me, the books are, in essence, adult tales. And to really appreciate the text, you really do need to be an adult, not just to understand the cultural references of Carroll's time, but to understand the life experiences. So when I used to be a university administrator. When I was a university administrator, I said, would say to people, just read Alice in Wonderland and you'll know everything you need to know about management. Because every chapter will teach you, and sometimes every paragraph will teach you something that you need to know about how to manage in a situation, how to get yourself extricated, how to deal with conflict management. So that part of I probably lean more towards your second category than I do towards the first for that reason. And I do think that, very importantly, I read many, many years ago that one needs to read Cervantes's Don Quixote as a teen, as a young adult, and in old age,
Hmm.
because you will understand and read things into it and see things differently at different ages in your life. And I think the Alice books are very much like that. You come to appreciate different things. And even those of us who have read the text many times and can recite whole passages, still will reread it, or reread a chapter, or reread one of the poems, and it's kind of like, wow, never saw that before. There's so much to distill in every one of those chapters, in each one of the poems, that I think that's why it's such a brilliant work. It's also one of the things that I think separates it from Oz.
I agree with that. And I read it to my daughter when she was 8 or 9, and she thought it was very funny and weird. But during Carroll's time, there probably certainly there's not all of the categories of publishing that we have now. He wasn't writing for middle grade or YA or young. So what was he writing for? Do you think he had an audience, or was this just the story? Because I know it's very satirical of his era, and he referenced the government a lot. He makes fun of the education, of the memorizing, and he's doing a lot of that, which I think is really interesting. But but he yet was writing for the and telling the story to these young kids. So, what do you think he was thinking in terms of how's my audience going to take this?
So originally, he had an audience of Alice and her sisters and himself. He was writing this to amuse them, but he was also writing it to amuse himself, I think.
Hmm.
And so he was not really thinking about publishing it when he first told the tales and when he first set down the manuscript and gave it to Alice Little. She was amused by the stories. She asked him to write them down. He wrote them down. He illustrated them. And originally, I think he thought, that's it, I'm done. And then other people read it and they said, you really should publish this. And of course, one of the key elements of the Alice books is they were the first books that were really not, they were really did not speak down to children. They were not moralistic tales.
Right.
This was adventures in Wonderland. And it was I think that was intentional. I think that's what he was after for his audience, to speak to children as if they are young adults, not to speak to children as they are little children. And, whether Alice herself reread the books later in life and saw things, we probably don't know. But I think that certainly other people and generations of people. I have a granddaughter who's 5 years old, and I brought her it was a copy of, I think I brought her Looking Glass. It might have been Wonderland. I honestly can't remember. Now she can look through the pictures. It's the classic of what's the use of a book without pictures? And I was giving her the very short version. We were not reading through the text at this point. It was just kind of like, what's happening on this page and this page. And this was the 5-minute version of Alice for a 5-year-old.
Right. Right.
But within a few, but then after I left, her parents told me, yeah, she went back to the book and she was spending a long time looking at the pictures. Every audience will appreciate it, looking for different things, and I think
Yeah.
that's the book.
Yeah. I started with a pop-up book. One of the and it has all the so it was magical just from the very beginning of it. I think it was the first pop-up book my daughter had ever seen. So you turn a page and a palace shows up or a character shows up. So any way to engage kids visually and then synopsizing and using your voice because those things they stick with them.
Absolutely.
And then they'll come back to it as you suggested later in life. I wonder the original manuscript with Lewis Carroll's drawings that must be very expensive. Is there a couple?
It's unique. There's only one copy of it.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, it's been republished. It's been there are facsimile editions, but the original is in the British Library.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the British Library recently had a cyber attack, and so you cannot currently access it
Oh,
online, but they normally have that available online as well. And on the very last page, there was a photograph of Alice Little and kind of an oval sized picture of her. And underneath that, he had originally drawn a picture of her. And for decades, people had no idea that the drawing existed.
hmm.
And then they finally realized it. And so now you can see both the original drawing and see the picture of this 6-year-old girl.
Just so the
Um,
listeners realize, the book was originally called Alice's Adventures in the Underground, right?
yeah, yes, Alice Underground.
Alice Underground. And that's the book we're speaking of. Is it a book that you can just touch there? I imagine not. Or you
Not at
could
the British,
at the British
only,
Museum. Yeah.
yeah, somebody would have to have a lot of scholarly credentials for them to
Yeah.
allow you to touch
Could
it.
you do that?
But
Do you have enough scholarly
no,
credentials
I
to
don't.
pull?
I don't think if I walked in and said, by the way, I just want to touch this.
I just want to
It's
flip a
kind of
few
funny.
pages.
The first time I went to the British Library, it was the British Library and the British Museum were in the same building,
Mm.
and you could still touch the Rosetta Stone,
Oh,
which I always, you can't do that anymore,
no,
fortunately, but I
no.
always wondered, really?
Well, I know that you're son of a photographer, or that you're a photographer and your kids are, one's an editor and one's an illustrator, correct?
So I am the son of a photographer.
Okay.
One of my sons is a film editor and photographer, and my other son is an illustrator. He teaches at a university level.
Just tell me about your son who's the film editor. What sort of projects does he work on?
Typically commercial projects.
Mm-hmm.
Started out in stand-up comedy.
Oh, wow.
Did that for 10 years.
Wow.
He actually published a Alice street photography in New York, Alice in Manhattan. Published an edition
Oh,
of his photography with using quotes from Alice.
oh, I want to
Uh,
include that. Oh, I'm so glad I asked. I definitely want to include that.
and still available. And then my other son does the illustrator. He does freelance illustration, but he also teaches. He's a professor of illustration at the University of Utah.
Oh, that's where I went to school. What's his name?
Michael Hirshon,
And your other son?
the one who did the book
Yes,
and film editing, that's Daniel Hirshon.
Daniel. And is your book, Alice in the World of Wonderlands, is that available?
We are about to we have two editions. There's a deluxe edition and a trade edition, standard edition. We're about to put that announcement out within the next week, I hope.
Okay, well,
So
when you put,
it's actually available right now on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. I could send you a link, but we have not sent out the official press release yet.
so you would be well equipped to share with listeners Lewis Carroll and his early photography, which would be considered cutting edge by today's standards in terms of the infancy, when he first started. So what do you think? I don't know if many people realize that took took photos of Alice Little and some of his sisters, but he had a lot of interesting techniques with his photography that were,
He, of course, at the time in days that he was doing photography, they had to sit very still
hmm,
for a longer period of time just for the exposure to be able to take. So he used to costume more girls, but girls and boys. He did adult photography. It was nearly very heavily portraiture. It was not always, but he would enact scenes. There's a picture of Alice as a little beggar girl in a
hmm,
beggar costume, and he would have these typically painted backdrops that he would use. But he had both pictures of people who were prominent at the time. Ellen Terry was an actress, for example. He has pictures of Ellen Terry, as well as he had photographs of many, many that were children. They were all actually published in, I think it was the 90s, might have been the 80s. The discovery of four nude photographs of children, which created quite the stir, which would then, these were all colorized, painted over in color. So yeah, he experimented quite a bit. And then when he lost interest, he just dropped it
hmm,
entirely.
hmm.
He just stopped at, probably around the 18, this I'm not sure of, but probably in around the 1880s, he just stopped doing photography entirely.
The photograph that you reference as the beggar girl, Will Brooker, the
Yes.
author who wrote Alice's Adventures, Lewis Carroll in pop culture, which was a terrific book, by the way.
Yeah.
And he has that photograph on the cover, and it's a
Yes.
remarkable photograph. It's, I mean, given when it was taken, and it's so vibrant, and she comes to life, and
His composition was excellent. He knew exactly how to pose whoever he was taking the photograph of. And sometimes it would be two or three picture people in the same picture, like two or three children, for example, might be in the same picture. And he would very elegantly pose these mise-en-scenes for his audience, for that audience, and that audience was typically the family. He was not setting up a shop, and he was not a portrait photographer by
mhm.
trade. He was nor was he trying to sell these as works of art. If you try and buy them now, they're expensive works of art. But at the time, he was doing this basically for his own enjoyment.
Interestingly, so far in our conversation, we have only referenced him as his pen name, Lewis Carroll, and not Charles Dodgson. Um, in your experience, in terms of just randomly speaking with folks about Lewis Carroll and they ask you questions at a dinner table, do people know Charles Dodgson? If you started the conversation by saying Charles Dodgson and blah, 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 out of curiosity?
Probably not. I mean, I can start a conversation, say something about Lewis Carroll, and I will have blank
Exactly.
statements. But I think unless I'm speaking with a mathematician, probably, or a logician, probably not. Most people who know Carroll's work reasonable,
Yeah.
have some reasonable knowledge of him. Probably, if you said the name, they would recognize it, but not necessarily make the immediate association.
It's just so interesting that his name has not become more prominent with all of the Alice out there, that it's always been Lewis Carroll and that there hasn't been a little bit more of a connection. Because in my conversations, nobody seems to know who Charles Dodgson is until, unless they're a big fan of his, of his work or something. So, but casually, certainly my kids don't know.
Right. And that was intentional on his part too. He wanted to keep his professional life as an Oxford Don teaching mathematics and logic separate from his creative fictional characters. And so, especially once Alice came out, people started to know that this is the Oxford Don is Lewis Carroll, but he continued to publish the books not under his real name. He continued to publish under his pseudonym, and that was intentional. He had two parts of his life, and he wanted to keep them apart.
But that is, I mean, it's interesting that it's continued. I mean, there's been a number of documentaries, there's a lot of novels or books about him, biographies, but it hasn't found any kind of pulp cultural reference. It's just curious that that hasn't happened given the depth.
Yeah. I think the closest it comes to a pop culture reference is the photographs of him, whether it's his self-portrait or whether they're portraits taken of him. If you showed a picture of him, somebody might say, I know who that is,
Mm,
and
right.
recognize him. But more likely, they would say, I recognize him as Dodson. I don't recognize him as, I recognize him as Carroll.
Yeah.
I don't recognize him necessarily as Dodson.
Okay. So here's a question for you. You love these different illustrations, and if you had to choose one illustration, and that's all, one illustrated book, and that's all you could have in that big library of yours, I'll tell you mine, and then you can tell me yours. Mine would
Okay.
be Ralph Steadman. Absolutely love Ralph Steadman's, and it's the lines, it's the kind of contemporary, it's the 60s vibe, it's that, it's not a surreal nightmare, it's a surreal world. And I just absolutely love his Alice book. How about you?
So I was afraid you were going to ask this question.
Oh, you were?
Yeah, I was
Really?
afraid you
It
would say you
just
could
popped
only
into
pick.
my head. I
Yeah,
thought, oh, well, I mean, he's a
I was,
scholar. I mean, like, let's break it up a little bit.
yeah. No, it's kind of like if you could only choose one. It's
Yeah.
this.
Okay.
This is
Well,
not an easy choice. I do love Stedman's illustrations. I love Barry Mosher's illustrations.
yes, yes,
I,
yes.
I love John Vernon Lord's illustrations, all for very different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
They worked in three different media. They worked in three different formats. They're all brilliant. If I had to pick one, absolutely had to pick one.
Yes.
Pick one who might not necessarily be well known. Willy Pagani was an illustrator in the early to mid 20th century. He did in 1929, I believe it is. He did a Flapper Alice. This was Alice
Oh,
done as a, and it is absolutely delightful. It's just brilliant work. And one of the reasons I like it so much is when I started collecting and I was leaving one of my places of employment to take another job, this the Pagani edition was given to me as a going away gift,
hmm,
and I've always
hmm.
treasured. And it's kind of funny because there were multiple editions published at the same time. There was a deluxe edition, there was more of a trade edition. And one of the things that's different about the trade edition is that, and the deluxe edition does not have this, ironically, is there are color end papers. The rest of it, all in the interior, is all black and white line drawings. The end papers are this montage, this collage of different scenes, all in color, and it's just each illustration. There's just so much to look at. There's so many things that he was the first one to do it, and that's really one of the things I look at in my scholarly interest is who was the first illustrator who did something different
Hmm.
with a scene, with a character.
And thank you for taking a chance and naming your one, your number one artist. I know that must be really hard.
There's another artist I should just mention briefly, Jean-Jacques Sempé, who most people know from his New Yorker covers.
Oh,
Uh, he published an edition in French, never came out in English, which is a real shame.
hmm.
In 1961, and just delightful, delightful. Um, one illustration per chapter, but each one's a gem. One of the things I point out is we've mentioned a few times Alice falling down the rabbit hole. Carroll in his manuscript has no picture of Alice falling down the rabbit hole. John Tenniel has no illustration of Alice falling down the rabbit hole. It's not until one of the early American pirated editions that somebody actually illustrates that scene. But everybody is sure that they've seen it before. And in fact, some of you haven't because
Right,
it took a
right.
while
It's
before that showed up, 1898 to be exact. Um, so those are the sorts of things that I look for. Is sometimes it's in the detail. That's one of the things I like about John Vernon Lord's illustrations is there's just so much to look at in those illustrations. There's a Russian illustrator who I absolutely think she's 21st century, absolutely brilliant,
who's that?
brilliant.
Who's that?
Ksenia Lavrova is her name. It's hard to come by her editions in the United States. You pretty much have to order them from abroad. I actually picked it up in Russia in a trip a while ago, but just the color illustrations and the level of detail. You could sit for an hour looking at one illustration and not see it all. That's how brilliant it is.
That's terrific. Well, definitely I'm going to check that out. And I'm really going to check out Alice as a flapper girl. That sounds.
There were two Flapper Alices, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Tim Henderson is the other one, much inferior.
Hmm.
Pagani is the one you really want to. Pogany is where he was a Hungarian.
And I liked you mentioned Barry Moser as well. His art, and I think he won. I think he won an award for his
Yes,
Alice book in the sometime in the 80s.
yes.
So it seems that every generation reinterprets Alice. So what do you think? In the 60s, there was sort of the psychedelic aspects of it because of the Beatles and the Jefferson Airplanes, White Rabbit, and the 80s, the 90s. There's the whole tech side of it with the Matrix, and what do you attribute that to? This repurposing of Alice to reflect, day to day life, and if what's Alice doing today?
So I think a lot of what you're speaking to, why it happens is it's the amusement of the illustrator amusing herself or himself, as well as introducing something that is generational. The fashion, for example.
Mm-hmm.
How does fashion change? And if I'm looking at a Tenniel illustration in the 21st century, these fashions don't mean anything to anybody.
Right.
And or the Pagani in the 20s, it would be in the bobbed hair and the flapper dress and those sorts of things would be something that would be very different for that generation. So some of it is speaking to cultural reference in fashion, in the backgrounds, in what's on the table. One of the things I collect is teapots. Has no relation to the Mad Tea Party. I've threatened to do a study of just the shapes of teapots in different illustrations. Um, but I think when you start looking at that, that's what starts to tell you why things change.
Mm.
It's they want to bring something new to it. They want to bring something interesting to it. They want to bring out some element of the story that nobody had brought out before, and they want to do it in a contemporary way. So there, for example, a lot of graphic novels,
Mm-hmm.
and an increasing number of graphic novels. We talked a little bit about the translations, but if you look at the illustrations that come out of other countries, even in the 20th century and certainly in the 21st century, the dress can be very, very different. The portrayal of how the characters look, if you look at a Japanese or a Chinese illustration or a Russian illustration, they're very different than a French or a German or an English, which is very different from an American
Right.
or a Latin American illustration. So some of why it gets reinterpreted in illustration is just to do that,
Mm-hmm.
is to make it relevant to the culture, the indigenous culture. One of the things I've looked at is which illustrators got republished in a country other than their own and which ones never did.
Hmm.
And why did that happen?
Right.
And I don't have a great answer to that. I think in some cases it was publishers were looking for what they could republish cheaply. And sometimes the not very best illustrations got republished. Um, but you know, in Esperanto, you probably don't. It probably doesn't matter what illustrations you use, but in other languages, it does.
Well, I suppose it also speaks to, why stories last because, they endure as timeless bridges that sort of connect us and connect generations and cultures and experiences. And, Alice just happens to work, like, as you mentioned, Japan, I think, has the most editions of Alice in Wonderland of any country. Is that a stat I read somewhere? But
That could be the Japanese and the Russians, and those two in countries in particular have a very deep interest in probably for very different reasons, but both have very strong number of editions.
I mean, but the larger question is, stories in general. I mean, stories that are generational that we hand down, and in handing down, we're sharing a piece of cultural connection to us, to somebody else who then's taking it and reinterpreting it for their kid.
Well, and I think part of it goes to the absurdist, surrealistic nature of the books, or at least they've been appropriated. The
Yes.
book has been appropriated by surrealists and absurdists. And each generation thinks that it is the first generation that has dealt with the complexities that it's had to deal with and the topsy-turvy nature of what's going on in its world. And that's why Alice continues to be relevant, because it was happening in the Victorian age, it's happening today, and it's happened in every decade in between. It's just been different. But, the surrealist illustrators, for example, or if you look at some of the very early films, they're very surreal.
Yeah, for sure.
And, that's why I think that these things last, is because you can pull out these elements that are so peculiar,
Hmm.
but they're timeless.
Timeless. Yeah, I think that's very true, how timeless it is, and you can interpret it in so many different ways. So, which is why I think there's 320 million views or videos of Alice in Wonderland stories or material on YouTube. I mean, that's kind of remarkable.
I actually didn't know that number, but that is remarkable.
It is. I mean, I have it somewhere. It's 320,000. 320 million times on YouTube content has been viewed. I don't know if you knew this, but there's 6 million Wikia views of Alice related pages.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I didn't know the specific number, but when we talk about illustrations, by the way, there are about 1,800 fully illustrated illustrators who have worked on fully illustrated editions. But the number of people who have illustrated put one thing up on the line,
Right.
a single illustration, or even put up multiple, but they never got published in a book, those are incalculable, I think.
I've put up a couple of those pages, by the way.
And they probably wound up on Pinterest someplace too.
I also,
Without your permission.
yeah, for sure, without my permission. I also spoke at one of your events, but it was, I don't know, it was probably 8, 9 years ago in New York. When you had I went to a Lewis Carroll conference and spoke and showed my artwork and the various books, graphic novels I was working on. And I've hired a lot of different concept artists, mostly people who've worked in Hollywood. And it's been really interesting to work with them and see how they interpret, and they're looking for something that's familiar, but they want to make it wholly their own, and they certainly want to make it part of the Looking Glass Wars, my book series. But there's always a nod, there's always a little detail, there's always something for fans of the original text and the original books, and so I'm always looking to do that, even if I've made up all sorts of stories about your society. And so the premise of, I'm going to come to another Lewis Carroll. I don't know if people know that he had many diaries, and there are missing pages from his diaries. And there's all sorts of speculation about, and some of it has to do with those photographs that he took of young Alice and that the parents were unhappy and things like that. I dismissed that, and I said the reason that he ripped out those pages is because Alice Little was actually Alice Hart from my series, and he didn't want people to know that he co-opted her story. I mean, granted, he thought she was traumatized from being on the street as an orphan. So there's little details that I've picked up over the years I'm no scholar, but I'm like, oh, I could use that. I could repurpose that. That'll be good metafiction. I'm giving away all my secrets here to you, Arnold, that I used, but
thank you.
You just have a tendency.
It's doubtful he ripped out those pages, by the way. It's more likely that his heirs ripped out those pages.
So is that I think Will Brooker wrote about that. I think he mentioned in his novel, in his book about Alice, or Lewis Carroll. It's just interesting that where did those pages go and what were they about? There was a riff between Alice Little and
Yes.
and Charles Dodgson over something. I don't know if anyone's figured out really, if there's any proof, if they know what it was about.
Well, the original riff was between actually Alice's mother and Dodson.
Right.
And I think that less and less, of course, one of the films that that does an interesting take on it, I'm sure you've seen it, Dream Child,
Yes, of course.
you know, wholly fictional, but what a great film.
Yeah, that really went outside of the books and found a way to tell the story that was edgy and of its era.
The reenactments of the scenes with her in them with the Jim Henson's workshop,
Yes.
um, just brilliantly done.
By the way, there was a photograph of Alice when she's 18 or 19 or 20 that Lewis Carroll took, and she looks very unhappy. What is the story behind that photograph? Do you know?
I don't know a lot about it. So two things. In most Victorian photographs, people look unhappy for a reason. The exposure time was so long that you
Uh,
could not hold a smile for very long. And so rather than do that, they just said, hold it. Because if they move their mouth, if you started with a smile and little by little it was going to go down, it would almost be like the Cheshire Cat smile. Little by little, you're going to see it disappear. And so now that's different between the mouth and the eyes. But the eyes, she probably, when she got married, she did not have the happiest marriage in the world.
mhm.
Uh, and so whether that might have been part of what's being reflected in that. And of course, Victorian childhood going into adulthood, there was this kind of hard break. It's kind of
Mhm.
like you're not a child anymore. You have to behave in a very certain way. Of course, Carroll was making fun of that in the books, but that was very true. That's the way they were raised. And so I think that would probably also help explain why in that photograph
Mm.
uh, she had left behind her childhood, and it's but she lived to a ripe old age.
Yeah, she did. She did. She traveled here for a celebration in the
Was yeah
20s
75th anniversary
of the novel.
of the publication of the book of the first book, and it was at Columbia University. Uh,
So Lewis Carroll gave us a lot of interesting words and terms. Obviously, down the rabbit hole, he didn't invent rabbit holes, but he made it a portal. Wonderland, I don't believe he invented that either, but it's certainly he invented that it's a magical place, curiouser and curiouser. But there are a lot of more obscure and words that he invented that are in culture today. Why don't you give us a couple of them that is not so well known, share with people?
well, Jabberwocky certainly has quite a lot of those. Frabjous Day,
Fraduous
uh,
Day, yes.
Frabjous
Frabjous, yes.
Day,
Which is a
you know,
fabulous day.
right, and Brillig, just the
Brillig,
opening
yeah.
toward Brillig and the slithy toves. I mean, there's hardly anything in that opening verse that he didn't make up.
Yeah.
And that, of course, Humpty Dumpty has to explain what every one of those words mean. If you string along Humpty Dumpty's whole explanation, it still doesn't make any sense, which I've tried to do multiple times. And it's kind of like Humpty Dumpty gives this whole long explanation, and it's kind of like he explains each word, but it doesn't make a sentence when you get to the end of his description of it. So yeah, I think there are certainly the Vorpal sword
hmm
is in that it's
I've made that into a really great weapon. hmm
yeah, I mean so there are lots of those things that he either made up or he popularized in a way that they would not have no one would know them today.
Wasn't Cary Grant, no, who was Humpty Dumpty in that 1930?
W.C. Fields,
W.C. Fields,
the
yes.
1933 Paramount film. Cary Grant was in it and now that you said that, I'm trying to remember which character he was. The White Knight was Gary Cooper. God, who was Cary Grant is in it? I'm going to have to try and remember.
Okay,
I watched
so
that one so many times.
okay, so if you were cast in that movie, who would they cast you as?
Well, it would be the White Knight.
The White Knight? Why?
I love the concept of it's my own invention.
Hmm.
I was in my work life, I would always come up with these off the wall solutions and always felt like it's my own invention. It makes no sense to anybody else. And it's kind of like, why would we do that? But I still thought it was a good idea. So I've always associated myself. And of course, the older I've gotten, and now in old age, I associate myself with the White Knight even more. That whole, and of course, Carroll himself associated himself with the White Knight. That's who he.
Oh,
That's that's his essentially self portrait of himself as a character, not necessarily the illustration, but as a character.
I didn't realize that. Well, I think that is a perfect place to end this very compelling and enjoyable and fun conversation. I thank you for being on the show and sharing all your insight. Often I have folks on that, have dabbled a little bit in Alice, and some, like there's some folks that are doing a musical of the Mad Hatter, but really to have a full understanding, and we could do this for hours. And you're a very engaging guest, so thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Okay,
Okay,
thanks so much.
cheers.
Have a
Bye
good
bye.
day.